So in this project, I express the relationship between the body and water through the medium of magical realism, looking at the plane of existence that we live on and the way in which we can visualise the deeper plane of existence that nature lives on. I was mostly inspired by John Locke's 1960 piece, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which speaks to the relationship between the senses and the body, where senses act as a transfer of nature to the mind. In this way, people are influenced by their environments, and I wanted to show the way in which the environment influenced the body and vice versa through this kind of glowing effect inspired by the understanding of the sublime. The understanding of the sublime comes from Immanuel Kant's representation. So the sublime may be described in this way: it's an object of nature, the representation of which determines the mind to regard the elevation of nature beyond our reach as an equivalent to a presentation of ideas. He goes on to say, the immediate pleasure in the beautiful in nature presupposes and cultivates a certain liability of thought. I wanted to use this idea of the sublime as something that was very glowing, something that was very magical, something that had a lot to do with literature as well as to do with visual culture and aesthetics. A particular quote I really enjoyed was then, "Let us suppose the mind be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished?" So I wanted to visualise the furnishing of the mind, the furnishing of this paper, by using physical and digital mediums to show the connectivity between physical sensation and emotional reaction. The quote as well also goes on to say, "This great source of most of the ideas we have, depending wholly upon our senses, is derived by them to our understanding, I call sensation." I'm trying to represent the sensation of the water on the body and the way in which the body reacts, but do it in a visually magical way. This image I took inspiration from Tom Hunter's project, especially the replication of the Jean Everett Millais Ophelia painting, where I have also previously replicated this painting a couple of times before in my photography experience, and I want to try it again in the context of the body and its relationship to water. I chose a pose that was similar to the original Ophelia painting, however it was a lot more modernised, and I used white dress to imitate innocence. For this personal interpretation, I focused heavily on the passage from Shakespeare as well, particularly on the element of mermaid-like and her clothes spread wide, which I wanted to replicate in this image. Focusing on the mythological inclusion of mermaid-like, I chose to use this water imagery and expand on that within the context of my wider project. I wanted to try and replicate the tonal similarities as well, because obviously on a digital image it has a lot of a different colour palette than the rather romantic painting, so I wanted to try and replicate that aesthetic in addition to replicating the posing. So for this particular image, I wanted to focus on a section from Ghost Image and talking about the idea of retouching and its relation to anatomy, where he says, of course, you have to know something about anatomy. A retoucher also creates photographic montages. So in this one, I wanted to outline the kind of nerves and muscular parts of the body in a retouching format to kind of ironize the idea of retouching an image to make it perfect, to make the outside perfect by actually presenting the inside of the image and the inside anatomy of the character. I also chose this deliberately out of focus kind of mystical imagery to play into that fantasy dreamlike element. For this image, I wanted to really focus on the femininity and the feminine relation to the body in the sea, which meant that I used a warmer, softer colour palette typically associated with romanticism, which often expressed high levels of femininity. However, I wish to subvert it in my own personal way by using that representation of strength and adversity as well as within this femininity by the repetitions of the silhouetted woman as a kind of larger power structure of femininity that we play into, a kind of structuralist approach to such a concept. So for this particular image, which is deliberately slightly out of focus and dark to kind of obscure the facial elements of the subject and focus on the background, which was a very burning sunset, I decided not to add any magical realist elements to the image in order to think about how much of what we see in terms of modern photography is actually real and what realism is in terms of a lens. For For example, this image, whilst it may look exactly as it was shot, it has adjustments. There's a vignetting, there's colour grading, there's tonal adjustments, there's exposure adjustments with the shadow highlights, flattening, there's tonal curves for every single red, green, blue channel. And I think it's interesting to see that anything is essentially altered reality when it's gone through the modern mechanisms of digital photography production. What is reality at the end of the day? What are we seeing, even if we believe we're seeing exactly as the camera shuts? How does that affect reality? Are we capturing a different amount of moments if we have a longer shutter speed, for example? This image has a longer shutter speed, and it kind of initiates the question of, is it more of a moment we're capturing with a longer shutter speed, even though the image will appear to the eye more obscured, more abstract, if you will, even though the camera was open for a longer period of time, technically capturing more reality, but the more reality it's captured in that moment, the more obscure the end result. Partly due to this discussion is why I decided to make the majority of these photos look as if they were shot on a 35mm camera instead of a 5D Mark III, which is what I'm shooting on, because film often has less of that post-production alternate. However, there are still elements of film photography where you can capture multiple moments at once, and whilst it may appear more abstract, something like double exposure appears more abstract, but it's technically two moments layered over the other. It's technically reality on reality. It's more relation to the actual human experience of reality, which doesn't happen at an individual second. It's not 1/250th of a second, it's many, many seconds, many minutes. I did to include videography, because videography is more close to our modern perception in that it is elongated over a period of time, but even then videography is often altered and colour changed and colour graded, such as my one is. So part of the reason that I've chosen to leave some of these images whilst looking visually unedited but actually edited is to initiate this discussion as to whether realism at the end of the day is realism now because of the mechanisms of the camera itself and the way in which we're capturing, editing, producing and sharing images, in that we no longer know what is actually the original and the organic and what has actually been changed, been altered to